So you'll have 20 out of 20 that are here today. Okay, we're going to start out this topic of Harry S. Truman and the Korean War with a profile on Harry S. Truman. He's a very interesting guy. He was kind of a guy that maybe doesn't get a lot of respect in American history that probably should. So we're going to tell you a little profile on Harry S. Truman. And this first part of it, I don't think you really need to write down. It's up to you. I'm just saying that Harry S. Truman took over the presidency, obviously, after the death of Franklin Roosevelt on April 12, 1945. Less than 4 months later, he made that fateful decision to drop the atomic bomb on Japan in an attempt to put an end to World War II. And we told you, as you probably remember, that his decision saved the lives of an estimated 1 million American soldiers who had probably been killed if Japan had been taken by what we call normal military force. So, I think he made the right decision. We live with that in history. And now once World War II is over, he's facing a new challenge to transform America, the American economy, from a wartime production to a peacetime production. Remember, we put all of our efforts into producing war equipment. So that's going to be his big challenge, is to transform the American economy from a wartime production to a peacetime production. So that's his job. But we're going to give you a little bit of a profile on him to tell you a little bit about a guy that not a lot of people know about, frankly, because he inherited a presidency. Okay, so again, once the war is over, he's going to face a new challenge to transform the American economy from wartime production to peacetime production. Okay, well, Harry S. Truman was born in Lamar, Missouri. Lamar, Missouri, on May 8th, 1884. Harry S. Truman was born in Lamar, Missouri, on May 8th, 1884. And he was the oldest of 3 children. He was the oldest of 3 children. And he was named after his uncle, Harrison Young. So he is the oldest of 3 children. And he is named after his uncle, Harrison Young. Now, it's kind of interesting because he was only given the middle initial S. He was not given a middle name. He has no middle name, just an initial, because Harry's parents wanted to please both of his grandfathers, who each had an S in their name. So rather than offend one or the other, they just gave him the middle initial of S, has no middle name. Now, when he was 6 years old, his family moved to Independence, Missouri. When he was 6 years old, the Truman family moved to Independence, Missouri. And that's where he went to both grade school and high school. So when he was 6 years old, his family moved to Independence, Missouri, and that's where he attended both grade school and high school. Now, after he graduated from high school in 1901, anybody want to guess what he planned on doing? What? Well, not so much into the war, because it hadn't really got going yet, right? But what he said is, where do you want to go? What's that? Well, good guess. He wanted to go to he wanted to continue his education. Where do you think he wanted to go? If I don't, you couldn't pick a college. So where do you think he wanted to go? It has to do with the military. He wanted to go to West Point Military Academy. Very good. He wanted to go to West Point. Well, he didn't get accepted. Anybody know why? What's that? His eyesight was so bad. He wore glasses since he was 8 years old, and his eyesight was not good enough to be accepted at West Point, which was a big disappointment to him. So, after he graduated from high school in 1901, Harry set his sights on attending West Point. However, since he wore glasses since he was 8 years old, his eyesight was not good enough to be accepted at West Point. So, instead of attending West Point, he simply went to work, went and got some jobs. And I'm going to tell you the 3 jobs that he worked on from 1901 until 1918. And what does he do? Somebody said it, what's he do in 1918? He goes to war. Okay, so I'm just going to tell you what Harry Truman did from the time he graduated from high school until he went to war, because he could not get into West Point. One of the jobs he had during that 17-year period of time is he worked as a timekeeper for the Santa Fe Railroad. He worked as a timekeeper for the Santa Fe Railroad. That's one of the jobs he had during that period of time. Timekeeper for the Santa Fe Railroad. He also worked in the mail room of a newspaper that was entitled the Kansas City Star. He worked in the mail room of a newspaper entitled the Kansas City Star. So he worked as a timekeeper for the Santa Fe Railroad. He worked in the mail room of a newspaper called the Kansas City Star. And he also operated the family farm. So those are the three things that Harry S. Truman did from 1901 until 1918 when he volunteered for action in World War I. He worked as a timekeeper for the Santa Fe Railroad. He worked in the mail room of a newspaper entitled the Kansas City Star, and he also operated the family farm. Well, he goes to war, and he will earn the rank of captain in World War I, and he was also a commander during the famous Battle of Meuse-Argonne. Okay, he was a commander in the Battle of Meuse-Argonne, which we talked about before. So he earned the rank of captain and was a commander during the Battle of Meuse-Argonne. Now, he had kind of an interesting incident happen to him while he was commanding, and it happened in March of 1918. He was commanding Battery D of the United States Army. Does anybody know what type of unit Battery D might be? Are they infantry? What are they? They're artillery. Very good, Blaine. They're artillery. So in March of 1918, Captain Harry S. Truman is commanding Battery D of the United States Army, which is an artillery unit. In other words, they're firing shells in the war. And an interesting event happens in March of 1918. Now, you got to know a little bit about Battery D first. They're a very poorly disciplined group before he got them. They had broken 3 other commanders down that had left before Captain Truman was put in charge. And he was not probably the most fearful looking man. You know what I mean? He wore glasses, kind of had the nerd look, wasn't very big. But somehow he was able to control to a point this undisciplined group of artillerymen in Battery D. Well, during the Battle of Meuse-Argonne, his men began to retreat because they were taking heavy fire from the German army. They got scared, so to speak, thought they were going to be overrun, and began to retreat. Well, Truman was normally known as a quiet commander, led by example, but when he saw his men retreat, he began to scream at the top of his lungs, cursing like a sailor, very out of character, and pushing his men to get back in the fight, to stop their retreat. So he just went ballistic, so to speak, yelled at the top of his lungs, cursed at them, pushed them back, and they were so surprised by his actions, they actually turned around and went back and continued their mission of artillery. So he earned a lot of respect. And when the fighting was over, Battery D did not have one loss of life in that battle. Every single member of Battery D survived Meuse-Argonne. And from that point on, Captain Truman's men loved him and respected him and stated on many occasions they would follow him. They would, quote, follow him to the gates of hell. Okay, so he earned tremendous respect despite his appearance because of that incident in March of 1918 during World War I. So he was a successful captain during that time. Well, he returns back home from World War I, and 6 weeks after returning, he marries his childhood sweetheart, Elizabeth Wallace. So 6 weeks after returning from World War I, Harry marries his childhood sweetheart, a gal by the name of Elizabeth Wallace. She was better known to her friends as Bess, B-E-S-S. They called her Bess. So 6 weeks after returning from World War I, Harry Truman marries his childhood sweetheart, Elizabeth Wallace, better known to friends and family as Bess, B-E-S-S. The Trumans only had one child. They had one daughter. Her name was Mary Margaret. And even though her name was Mary Margaret, they referred to her as Margaret by her middle name. So they had one daughter, Mary Margaret. Well, what else did he have to do after he got back? And his marriage. And find a job. So what he did is he took all of his money and he invested in a men's clothing store in Kansas City with a really close friend by the name of Eddie Jacobson. So after his return from World War I and his marriage to Bess Truman, he decided to invest all the money he had in a men's clothing store, which was located in Kansas City, and he went into partnership with one of his best friends, Eddie Jacobson. So what time period was this? Where are we at? About 1920s. Well, what's happening in the 1920s? Great Depression. And so in 1921, because of the Great Depression, that clothing business failed, and the two men still owed a substantial amount of money from their business loan because they invested their money, but they didn't have enough, so they took out a big loan to help them start this men's clothing store. Well, it went down the tubes during the Great Depression, and both men still owed a substantial amount on their business loan. Now, what could they have done to take the easy way out? What a lot of people did. They could have declared bankruptcy. Well, Truman wouldn't take the easy way out, and he and his partner pledged to pay back their loan, and it took Truman personally 15 years to pay off his part of the debt. So Harry Truman did not take the easy way out. He could have done that, declared bankruptcy. Instead, he said, I will pay my debts, and even though the fact it took me 15 years to pay off just his part of the debt, he did so. And after this failed business endeavor is when Harry S. Truman decided to seek a career in what? Politics. Very good. So it took him 15 years to pay off his debt, and after this business failed, he decided he would seek a career in politics. Okay, and I'll kind of give you his political career here.
So you said that their business went down to 21 because
they were feeling the effects, and it actually failed in 1921. Even though some of that stuff happened later, they felt it early.
Yeah, because I thought the 20s were
Well, the early parts were. They just weren't having much luck, and then got hit by the Depression. Okay, well, in 1922, Harry Truman was elected as a county judge, and he represented Jackson County, Missouri. So this is his political career. In 1922, he was elected as a county judge of Jackson County, Missouri, and he actually served as county judge on two different time periods. Okay, he served from 1922 to 1924, and then again from 1926 to 1934. So he took a little vacation in there, so to speak. So in 1922, Truman was elected as county judge of Jackson County, Missouri, and he served as a county judge in that county in Missouri two different time periods. The first term was 1922 to 1924, and then he came back and served from 1926 to 1934. Why did he have a break? He didn't win the election in between the two, right? Okay, so he ran, won, ran, lost, ran, won. Well, he set his eyes on the United States Senate. And in 1934, after serving as the county judge the second time, he was elected to the United States Senate, serving the state of Missouri. Okay, so he was elected to the United States Senate in 1934, and he served for 10 years in the Senate, from 1934 to 1944. So he was elected to the United States Senate in 1934 and served there for 10 years, representing the state of Missouri. What happened to him in 1944? He was nominated as Truman's vice presidential candidate and was elected vice president in the election of 1944. So during the Democratic National Convention, Senator Truman was chosen as Roosevelt's vice presidential running mate, and with Roosevelt's election to his fourth term in 1944, Truman became vice president of the United States. And then we know with President Roosevelt's death in 1945, he became the nation's 33rd president of the United States.
In 1945.
The 45 is when Roosevelt died, and then he became president. He assumed the presidency. Now, he served the rest of Roosevelt's term, which we'll talk about, and then he was elected to his own term as president in the election of 1948. And we'll talk about that election too in detail. So after serving the remainder of Roosevelt's term, Truman was then elected to his own term in 1948, but his popularity was hurt pretty bad by the Korean War and his poor relationship with popular World War II General Douglas MacArthur. Did not get along with MacArthur toward the end of the war. We'll explain that to you also. So his popularity was hurt badly by the Korean War, and his poor relationship with popular World War II General Douglas MacArthur is going to cost him any chance of his own re-election in 1952. And we'll talk about those in detail. Matter of fact, Truman, after the troubles with the Korean War and the troubles with MacArthur, he didn't seek re-election in 52, and he left the White House and retired to his home in Independence, Missouri. That's what he did. Okay? Now, what do presidents do when they retire? They do two things. They write their memoirs, which are usually a book or two, your volumes, and then they work on their presidential library and museum that's normally placed in their hometown. Well, during his retirement, Truman published two books. And he published them in 1955 and 1956. They were his memoirs. One of the books was entitled Year of Decisions. I think these are on your ID sheet. And the other one was entitled Years of Trial and Hope. Now, there's a really eerie, ironic story about this book, and I'll tell you in a minute. So here are the memoirs of Harry Truman, first edition, first printings. First one was entitled Year of Decisions, and the second one was entitled Years of Trial and Hope. Here they are. Okay? Now, after, or not after, but during the time he was writing his memoirs, he also helped with the construction of the Harry S. Truman Library and Museum, and guess where that is located? Independence, Missouri, and that opened in 1957. So in 1955, 1956, and 1957, after his retirement, Truman was in the business of writing and publishing two books and helping with the construction of his personal presidential library, the Harry S. Truman Library, which opened in 1957 in Independence. And I'll come back to the weird thing about that book in a minute. Well, on December 5th, 1972, Truman became ill and entered a local hospital with severe lung congestion. Okay? On December 5th, 1972, President Truman became ill and entered a local hospital having severe lung congestion. And a result of complications, etc., from that condition, he died 3 weeks later, the day after Christmas, on December 26th, 1972, at the age of 88. So, as a result of complications from a severe lung congestion, he dies 3 weeks after he was admitted to a hospital, the day after Christmas, December 26th, 1972, at age 88. He was buried at the Harry S. Truman Library in Independence, and when his wife, Bess, died, she was then buried at his side. Okay, so they are actually buried at the museum and library. It's pretty cool. They have a place for it. I've been there, and it's pretty cool. And so that's where he's buried. Now, here's the ironic thing before we move on to the next subtopic. When Martin Luther King gave his I Have a Dream speech, he said, free at last, thank God Almighty, I am free at last. And he turned and he handed the speech to a guy by the name of George Raveling, who was a student who was acting as a kind of bodyguard for Martin Luther King during the speech. Raveling went on to become a head basketball coach at Iowa, USC, very good basketball coach. Anyway, he just forgot about the speech and one day was thinking about it, and I'll show you the video on this when we get to that, but the point is, he took that speech, that original speech that Martin Luther King gave him, and put it inside his copy of Truman's memoirs, and just put them away for 30 years. And then when this thing started coming up about the anniversary and it got more interesting, he brought that out, and he has the original speech from Martin Luther King Jr., George Raveling. That's where he stored it, was inside the memoirs of Harry S. Truman, which was kind of interesting. Okay, we'll talk about that later. Okay, let's talk about legislation or laws that were passed during the time that Harry S. Truman served the remainder of Roosevelt's term. Okay? Legislation passed during the Roosevelt term. In other words, these are things that were passed when Truman served the rest of Franklin Roosevelt's term. And they actually passed 4 pretty important pieces of legislation through Congress during that time. And the first one was known as the GI Bill of Rights, which still exists today. GI Bill of Rights. Now, when we think of GI Bill of Rights, what comes to our mind right away? What's the big benefit from the GI Bill of Rights? Anybody know?
Yeah.
They pay for your college. If you serve and come back, they'll pay for your college. It wasn't just that, but that was part of it. There were several benefits for veterans of foreign wars that the GI Bill of Rights did. Number one is it gave veterans of foreign wars government loans at a low interest rate to purchase homes when they got back from war. So that was one benefit of the GI Bill of Rights, is it gave veterans of foreign wars government loans at a lower interest rate to purchase homes. That was called a GI loan or a GI Bill. My mom and dad borrowed money and bought a house or 2 when I was growing up, and my dad got the GI Bill, low interest loan, to buy a home. The second thing the GI Bill of Rights did is it also gave low interest government loans to veterans to start a business or to start a farm. So it gave government loans, low interest loans to veterans to start both their own businesses if they wanted to, or they could start a small farm. The third benefit that the GI Bill of Rights did is it gave pensions to veterans along with hospital care. Pensions and hospital care.